Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to this week's edition of our Thursday morning briefing series. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Joint Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing this morning's briefing. The title of today's briefing really speaks for itself. What if? What if Donald Trump were to win the 2024 US presidential election? What if he radically reverses American foreign policy, retreating into some kind of erratic isolationism, building walls and trade barriers, abandoning Europe, withdrawing from international institutions, putting off traditional partners, and turning instead to deal-making with authoritarian leaders around the world? It is high time to consider this scenario, given Trump's success in the primaries and polls, and given the geopolitical effects that the sheer prospect of his election is having already. As it happens, our DGAP Director Gotthard Wolff has co-authored an article on these questions with a group of experts, including former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, Arancha González, who is with us here today. The piece is titled Trump-Proofing Europe, and it came out in Foreign Affairs about 10 days ago, which was before Trump made his remarks about undermining NATO security guarantees, so there's probably even more to discuss now. This is a timely discussion too, given that tomorrow is the first day of the Munich Security Conference, one of the most important and long-standing transatlantic platforms for exchange. DGAP will be at the Munich Security Conference from later today, putting up a range of side events on German foreign and security policy, and we'll be back in Berlin with a wrap-up event for our members on Monday. But this morning, we want to focus on the impact of a potential second Trump term for Europe. And to do so, we have a wonderful and distinguished panel, which I'm glad to introduce now. Our first speaker is Arancha González Laya, the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain from 2020 to 2021. A lawyer by training, she was previously Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director of the International Trade Center from 2013 to 2020, and before that, Chief of Staff to the Director General of the WTO. Next will be Daniel Benjamin, who is President of the American Academy in Berlin. Before coming to Berlin, Daniel Benjamin was Director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. And before that, he was, amongst other things, Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the US Department of State. Glad to have you, Dan. And finally, last but not least, Professor Gotthard Wolff, who is Director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, who was previously Director of Bruegel, the Brussels-based think tank devoted to policy research on economic issues. And since 2023, Gotthard is Honorary Professor at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy at the University of Erfurt. Glad to have you, Gotthard. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind you that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We will kick off our conversation here on the panel and then open up for questions after 30 minutes or so. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and keep your questions and comments to a length that will allow us to pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to all my colleagues helping in this event series. And now, without much further ado, over to you, Arancha. What if? How to make Europe Trump-proof?
Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you to the DGAP for organizing this very timely debate on the eve of the Munich Security Conference, and somehow a bit of a curtain raiser for many of the themes that will be debated in Munich. I mean, let me say that, and let me start with this humbleness that we need when we enter into this conversation, to say that we Europeans knew we had to grow up. We've known this for a little bit of a while, and we know this because the world around us was becoming more brutal. It was becoming more hostile. It was more hostile with wars returning in the European continent, with a neighborhood around the EU which was full of fires. One only needs to look at a map of the world, with economic interdependencies that were being weaponized, and frankly, also with a democracy that was being eroded, including from within the European Union. So we knew that we had to grow up. We knew that we had to take greater responsibilities. This sentiment was a bit accelerated during the presidency of Donald Trump, where Europeans felt treated not like partners, let alone allies, but rather in certain respects, almost like rivals. We realized that things we cared about, values we cared about, priorities we thought were important for the international community, from climate change to international trade to the defense of human rights, were being dismissed by the president of our ally. And I want to stress this. It was painful because we understand, this is very clear for us, that we growing up would be a little bit easier if we could count on an ally rather than on a rival. There was also a particular difficult chapter for us during that period, which was this constant weakening of NATO, this constant threats about this sacrosanct alliance, which is the most intimate, on the most intimate topic that an alliance is built on, which is the security and defense of Europe. So we knew we had to do that. We, in a way, have been moving in that direction. This is what we did post-COVID with pulling more investments, investing together, mutualizing our debt. We knew we had to do it with the creation of a European Defence Fund that would help us in financing investments, in supporting friends and partners around the world. And now we are getting, in a way, to a crunch point. And this crunch point is double. This crunch point is the election in the US, but this crunch point is also the election in the European Union. And we need to make sure that the choices that we make are made by us, that we don't, in a way, put our future in the hands of the electorates somewhere else, or that we put our future in the hands of other countries that are not our partners, nor are they our allies, but rather our rivals. So, we in Europe are coming to a bit of a difficult moment. We are looking at the elections in the US. If we look at the polls, and since you invited us, Jan, to look a little bit at what if, we can see that the polls are looking in the direction of Donald Trump. This is a decision that at the end of the day, American voters will have to make. We will respect whichever choice they make. This is democracy. But there are three areas where we feel, where I feel we have to be a bit more, invest ourselves more to have a bit more strategic autonomy, to have a little bit more of a say in our future, starting with security and defense, and investing more intelligently in what really would give us this strategic autonomy in security and defense that may not necessarily be today in tanks or troops, but in enablers that would help us with some sort of all-encompassing security. We have to invest more in our own economic security, and we have to invest more in protecting our own democracy, because this is what would give us credibility to stand up for democracy also internationally. All of this basically moving from the American election to the European election, and maybe concluding this opening remarks, puts us in front of a choice of, again, taking our future in our hands, and this essentially means integrating the European Union more, pulling more of our efforts, of our financing, of our sovereignty in order to be more sovereign, to make our decisions, or put our future in the hands of somebody else. So let me stop here, Jan. Thank you. And of course, very happy to take questions, comments, or observations at the second.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Arancha. And I'm sure that we will come back to questions of integration, economic security, and really nail down what that means in the conversation as we proceed. But for now, let me hand over to Daniel Benjamin for his opening remarks, helping us hopefully to decipher what's going on in the US and how Europe can prepare.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. I am not muted. Good. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be invited here and to get to speak on this rather weighty issue with such distinguished colleagues. Let me begin with a little bit of what might be called cockeyed American optimism. It's here. I'm sitting in Berlin, and every German I know is convinced that Donald Trump is going to win the election in the fall. And there is something to be said for being prepared for the worst. And my mother always used to say, prepare for defeat, victory takes care of itself. And the polls are certainly worrisome. However, during peacetime, American presidents with the economic indicators that we are seeing now in the United States have always won. Now we are in a new era in which, interestingly, there's a big division in the country, and Democrats are feeling more optimistic about the economy, about all the growth, about the strong employment, and Republicans are managing to convince themselves that things are in a dire situation. So a situation like this in the era of social media is an interesting real experiment. But having said that, and having watched the primaries that have happened, or the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary, I think that Donald Trump has significant electoral vulnerabilities. The indications are that something like a quarter to a third of members of his own party don't want to vote for him, and he is not picking up independents. And that is not a sustainable position if he wants to win the general election. He's going to probably, we don't know for certain, be in courtrooms during much of the campaign season. He stands in peril of having a significant part of his fortune stripped of him by a court in New York. And the polling indicates that many Republicans would not vote for someone who has been convicted of felonies, and there's a decent chance that will happen by the election. So I understand the need to Trump-proof both in economics and security, but one shouldn't convince oneself absolutely that Donald Trump is the future. Having said that, I think it's a very, very useful discussion to be having regarding what Europe can do to Trump-proof. If I can take what Arancha said just a moment ago, Trump-proofing, in a sense, is Europe taking more responsibility for its security, both in terms of hard power and economics. And of course, it should have started a long, long time ago, and Europe will have a very challenging time establishing the kind of security it wants so that it can withstand any of the blows that Trump may deal to NATO and the transatlantic relationship. That said, given the crisis in Ukraine, I do think that European leaders would be well advised to start pouring everything they can into building their security and building whatever resources they can, delivering whatever resources they can to Ukraine, so it can continue to hold off the Russian onslaught. And this is also good for Europe as a whole, of course, and I would argue for America as well. But I appear before you in the embarrassed situation of having the U.S. House of Representatives having thwarted, at least for the time being, funding for Ukraine, which is a huge embarrassment. Finally, I would say on the concept of Trump-proofing, it's a good idea, but you can only predict so much with Donald Trump. And, he could very well turn around if there's enough blowback in his own party or in the public at large, and look at the fact that 18 NATO members are now meeting the 2% threshold, and say, you see, my tools of intimidation worked. The historians may differ on what the causes were, but the point is that he is the agent of chaos. He will turn in ways that no one can really predict. I do think Europe should be prepared to be transactional, and being transactional involves having sticks as well as carrots, and that the area in which that will be relevant will be primarily in economics, and that will be quite difficult for the EU, which really does believe in the liberal rules-based order and the WTO. But I think that the ability to give as good as you get is going to be absolutely essential for Europe to stand up to someone who is simply a bully. Anyway, I will stop there. I do think that there are reasons to be a little optimistic, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for helping us to make sense of what is indeed an unpredictable politician. I think a much more predictable actor in many ways has been the German government in the past, but also predictably strong in economic terms and weak in security terms, with all the discussions related to that. So perhaps, Guntram, in your remarks, you could say also a few words about from a German point of view. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jan, for organizing this, and thank you to all the colleagues for organizing this morning. So I really wanted to make 3 points and start off with the last point of Dan, which is, Europe has to prepare to be more transactional with incoming US President Trump. Now, the real question here is, will the EU as a whole be transactional, or will individual member states be transactional and on a bilateral basis try to strike deals with the new US president? Now, what our piece does, and it was deliberately written with 5 colleagues from 5 major EU countries, is to say, well, don't fall into the trap of striking bilateral deals on a country basis, because it's going to cost you dearly and it's not going to provide the kind of insurance and the kind of security that you need. So the first point really is about, in a moment of tensions in the transatlantic relation with US President Trump, we need to stand together, we need to work together, and we need to increasingly collaborate, in particular on our security. And so the first dimension that we discuss in this paper is really about the security situation. And what it says is essentially 2 things. It says, well, we need to deliver as many weapons as possible, as early as possible to Ukraine. Europe at the moment is already the major supporter of Ukraine. If you take all the support of the European Union and its member states to Ukraine, it amounts to twice that of the United States. But when you look at the military support, in fact, it's roughly the same size. So if the US was not to be there, then we have a really significant shortfall. And that means that we all have to step up, and especially countries that still haven't delivered so much but have material in stock, they need to step up. We need to stand together in this situation. And the sort of more long-term security dimension that we discuss is, well, what if Trump was to sort of question the validity, the strengths of Article 5 of NATO? And in a sense, the piece was written before he made these remarks, but the remarks sort of proved us right that we need to have this debate about what are the strategic assets, military assets, that at the moment only the United States provides within NATO and that we do not yet provide. And the paper lists a few of those strategic assets. The key point here is to say, let's think about these strategic assets and let's, as much as possible, decide collectively on who is investing into these assets and how to provide these assets. Because if everybody on its own tries to ensure and secure the continent, it's going to be much more costly than currently, and it's really unnecessary to do this. It's much better to find ways of collaborating and sharing the burden, and that's sort of the first big point we are discussing. The second big point, and I want to be quicker on that, is about economic security. We really focus on three major dimensions in economic security. The first is trade. I mean, trade is an obsession already in the Biden administration. Trade policy, to my mind, is ill-guided and actually detrimental to global welfare and not really helping enough security. But under a Trump presidency, the US may well become really protectionist with tariffs against European producers. The Trump 1 presidency has done that. That would be harmful to our economic relation, and we have to prepare for certainly more protectionism from the US. We have to also think about the risk of secondary sanctions that a US president could impose on European firms that are active in China. And last but not least, we really have to think about our digital sovereignty, because most of our data systems, starting from GPS geolocation to satellite communication to cloud computing to, basically most daily applications that we use, they are very much based on US systems that shouldn't be a problem. But there are already now some issues as regards data security and data privacy. They are solved at the moment in a cooperative manner. If that cooperative manner isn't there anymore, it really becomes quite difficult. And so there are certainly some dimensions that deserve more attention, in particular when it becomes security relevant. So this is something one has to look into. And so the third point I really wanted to make is about the defense of democracy, which is in itself a huge issue. But I do want to remind our listeners that under the first Trump presidency, we had an active attempt by by Donald Trump and Steve Bannon, his advisor in the White House, to really bring together populist parties across the continent. And he was actively supporting Marine Le Pen. He was actively supporting and coalescing with Hungarian and Polish right-wing forces. So this is something that shouldn't be taken lightly, because ultimately it is, of course, the strength and the resilience of democracy that might be at stake, and that will require determined action by Europeans and determined action early on. So on the whole, I think the piece, and there I agree with Dan, it's not certain that Trump will get into the White House. It might actually still be less likely. But many of the things we are discussing are things that we should be working on as Europeans anyway. We should be working on them because the United States will increasingly look towards Asia. But under a Trump presidency, that would get much more urgency. And so in a sense, what we are saying is, let's use now the electoral period, the campaign period ahead of the European Parliament's election, to discuss some of these big issues and to perhaps develop some platforms that give a mandate to the new incoming European leadership to work on these issues. And so in that sense, just to provoke the debate in my last sentence, I think the contribution by the SPD top candidate, Katharina Barley, to say, well, we have to think about the nuclear umbrella is a good provocation, because it helps us focus on the big questions. And so in that sense, I would say It's welcome that we have that debate, and the paper tries to sort of structure that debate around those three major issues. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Guntram. And I'm sure we'll come back to the nuclear question as well. But allow me to ask two brief follow-up questions before we open up the debate to our audience. And let me already encourage our audience to come forward with questions by posting in the chat, or which we prefer actually by just raising your hand and coming in. And I see already a hand shooting up. But allow me to ask two quick follow-ups, because Arancha, you and also Guntram, both of you made this point about more European integration, especially in the field of hard security and economic security. But if we look at the current polls, looking at the European elections coming up as well, which you, Arancha, described as one of the crunch points, we don't really see a clear signal for popular support to really address those big projects of integrations that seem to be needed there. So if you could just say a few words on what the prospects are, Arancha, that would be appreciated. And let me ask Dan a follow-up question as well, but because you already alluded to the fact that a second Biden term might pose some problems as well, and especially if we look at the situation in Congress and the lack of support on Ukraine at the moment. Perhaps you could give us a sense of which parts of the Trump-proofing article might turn out to be relevant in another scenario as well. So if I could hand over to Arancha first and Dan, and then we'll bring in more questions and open the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. I would say that first we have to make sure that we frame the election, the European 2024 election, for what it really is. It is a moment where the EU finds itself in a bit of a crossroads, and it depends on which direction the EU will take. And I think this is what we need, how we need to frame this election. And this is how we have to debate and discuss with citizens. This idea that citizens are against, in my view, is a bit too quick, too fast, unchecked. We also said that when Russia invaded Ukraine, we said that that Europe would not remain united, that citizens would not support the EU helping Ukraine, that citizens will get tired very soon. And here we are, many months after. We have millions of Ukrainians as refugees in our countries. They have been integrated in the labor market. They are part of our societies. We have adopted sanctions on Russia that have been painful for us, but I think they keep coming, and they keep coming in a manner that is supported by all EU member states. Yes, there is the usual wrangling here and there. There is the usual horse trading, but at the end of the day, the packages have been adopted. And yes, we are making important economic efforts to support Ukraine to the tune of the last package having been adopted a couple of weeks ago, $54 billion. And let me remind the audience that this puts the European Union at about double the support to Ukraine than that provided by the US, all-encompassing, economic and military. So why am I saying all of this? I think it's because the European citizens have understood, and maybe a little bit different in the different member states. It's true that it's not with the same figures in all member states, but by and large, the European citizen has understood that this is a way to protect the European Union against neighbors, a neighbor in this case, that is ready to violate the rules of the game by going unilateral and invading another country. And I think they've seen that this is fundamental to protect the European Union. So how we frame the election, the European elections of 2024 will matter. Now, if we make this an issue of let's incite protest against the incumbent at home. Let's make this a domestic issue. Let's not make this a European issue. Then for sure, the results may be slightly different. So it's upon all of us, and especially it's upon the central political forces in the European landscape to make this, in a way, it's a bit too much, but quote unquote, a referendum on what the European Union should do moving forward, with or without Trump. Trump accelerates the need to take this conversation. Trump makes it more complicated because it's easier to become more autonomous when you've got a kinder environment around you, and Trump is not going to make it kinder. We know this is a bit the direction we need to decide if we take or not. But for sure, this is the question that will be in the ballots in the June elections 2024.
Thank you. And this nicely segues into the question I raised for Dan. To you.
Well, a few things. First of all, I want to come back to something Guntram said and maybe sharpen it a bit. I think the strategic dimension and the nuclear dimension of the current situation is absolutely critical. And I don't think that there are actual, measures that need to be taken in the next few weeks. But I do think that the Europeans need to start talking about nuclear sharing in a more engaged way. You don't want to wake up on January 21st and realize that you're in a wholly changed world for which no one is prepared. That's an unpleasant prospect. It's an issue that Europeans have avoided talking about for a long time. But I think it would be a good thing to do. It would also send a powerful message to an incoming Trump administration. Regarding what Europe should do for a second Biden administration, well, I agree to a large extent with what Arancha said. It's really what things that Europeans should be doing for themselves and for from the perspective of global stability. And a significant leap forward in self-sufficiency in terms of military procurement and military integration is the right place to start. Even if everything goes as well as anyone could have hoped, and the U.S. delivers its next $60 billion for Ukraine, we have significant supply chain problems. Russia has managed to build its to increase its ability to produce military hardware at a pretty remarkable rate. Ukraine is firing, one shell for basically every 4 or 5 the Russians are shooting, and this is an unsustainable situation. It's depressing to think that the post-Cold War period of peace and stability is over, but it absolutely is. And everyone needs to increase their defense spending in a coordinated way so that there isn't a ridiculous amount of duplication and so on and so forth. And, that's a great place to start. It's a great place to start as well because the U.S. will inevitably feel that it has to deploy more of its resources to the Far East and to consider Taiwan, the challenges of a rising China. We also have challenges in the Middle East. And so, there's an awful lot on the American plate. And President Biden is committed to, a pretty traditional view of American security policy in which we have global interests. One of the, just as a footnote, as Europe builds its capacities, it should start thinking about essentially continental defense. It doesn't have to worry about some of the big ticket items that the U.S. does, like refueling capacity and a great blue water navy. So, Europe has, I think, an agenda ahead of it, and the key thing is to get going. The other thing is that, and I think Arancha alluded to this, The EU needs to become a more nimble partner. Qualified majority voting needs to become, a reality, and an ability to take action quickly without enormous amounts of haggling. It maybe boggles the mind that we could get there very quickly, but that is the kind of refitting that I think Europe needs to go through to be the effective partner that Americans really hope for, that Americans really want to work with. We recognize, at least in my patch, in the blob, in the traditional foreign policy establishment, the absolute, essential utility and importance of these alliances, and we need to make them more and more effective. So why don't I stop there?
Thank you. I see, Guntram, you've been taking notes busily, and I'll take you up in a moment to respond. But I want to open this up to our audience and invite people to briefly introduce themselves and ask a challenging question. I will pick up something from the chat in a moment as well. But first, over to you, Klaus Wittmann.
Good morning. Klaus Wittmann. I teach contemporary history at Potsdam University. Regarding the debate of the last 2 or 3 days, I would like to warn us all against weakening the US commitment to extended deterrence by speculating about European or even German nuclear weapons. The reference to French nuclear weapons gives me a sense of déjà vu. Already 40 years ago, as a young lieutenant colonel in the MOD in Bonn, I was involved in attempts to find out more about French nuclear strategy. And of course, their nuclear arsenal adds to NATO and US deterrence, but can never replace it. And a German nuclear weapon, think of the 2+4 treaty, the NPT, the cost, the time needed, let alone public debate, and the attitude of our neighbors. So I have 2 quick questions to the panelists. What do you think about this nuclear debate? And to David Benjamin, echoing your optimism, would you not think that there is still so much common sense in the American electorate that Trump is about to disqualify himself by openly encouraging Putin to attack NATO members?
Thanks very much. I want to invite Guntram first to pick up this question and perhaps a few responses to the previous debate, and then Daniel.
Well, I mean, so the nuclear question is, of course, a very complicated and big question, right? That involves many, many dimensions. My first reaction was it's welcome to have that debate. And why is it welcome? Well, basically because even our former Chancellor Angela Merkel already said under Trump 1 presidency, we cannot 100% rely anymore on the US. And I think under a second Trump presidency, we will have a much more determined and effective administration, in the sense that it's more in line with, the traditional Republicans will be replaced, and we will have really Trump loyalists in key positions across the US. Now, then the question is, what does this debate mean, and how can we structure it? And, to me, the key question is, if you are in Poland or if you are in the Baltics, what kind of arrangement will give you enough confidence that you feel you have a nuclear shield, a nuclear umbrella? Now, at the moment, it's clear it's only the US, and the temptation will be to strike bilateral deals with Donald Trump to keep having that kind of shield. Now, that will be to the detriment of the European unity. It will be to the detriment of the single market, and it will therefore, in many dimensions, be a bad policy. And so in that sense, I think it's good to have that debate. I would completely agree with Klaus Wittmann that the solution is not a German nuclear bomb. I mean, that would be, legally it's not possible. I think it would also send the wrong signals to our European neighbors, and so on and so forth. So I would warn us against that. But I also want to warn us against a scenario in which a country to the east of Germany, perhaps Poland, is thinking about its own nuclear ambitions. So I think we at some stage we have to have that debate, and the logical endpoint is something like a European bomb, with all the difficulties of the way to get there. Now, in between, and it's going to be, I mean, we don't have the decision-making process, we don't have the funding, so it's a very, very long way. So in between, what we have to do is we have to talk about nuclear sharing with the French and the Brits, that will involve serious debates, because otherwise it's not going to be credible in the east of Europe. It's not going to be credible. So I think this is a very important debate, and it needs to be a serious debate, because especially the countries in the East, they really want to have something that is very, very convincing.
Mm-hmm. Dan?
Yes, well, I agree with Guntram on the nuclear issue, and I don't want to do anything to undermine extended deterrence at all, but the conversation is important. And as I said, we don't have to take concrete steps at this point, but you don't want to wake up without any arrangements if, God forbid, Trump is elected. So on the issue of the wisdom of the American electorate, one should be, well, prediction is folly. Let's just say that. So I do think that it is true that there are days on which it seems like Donald Trump is the best friend Joe Biden could have. And at a moment when everyone was twittering about Biden's age, Trump, needed the spotlight himself and made these outrageous comments about NATO and about America's allies. But I would caution viewers on 2 points. Number one, American elections in peacetime are not won or lost on foreign policy issues. Number two, the Trump base truly does love and admire Vladimir Putin and views him in a way similar to the way some Europeans do, as the defender, and I'm thinking here of Orban in particular, but as a defender of traditional Christian values. I don't think you can just wish that away, even if it does bespeak a really hardened kind of cognitive bubble that seems impervious to actual facts and any discussion of what the man's policies truly are. So, yes, I do think that these shockers for Trump do help, and I align myself with those American pundits who say that Trump should be put on the major television broadcasters' news shows, because it will remind people of just how outrageous many of his points are. There's a hefty debate going on in the U.S. about how much press you actually give him when he says, outrageous things. But I wouldn't. But this alone is not going to decide the election.
Thank you. There's a fairly technical legal question in the chat, which I would like to pick up by Ray McGill, asking, also directed at you, Dan, how do you think the Supreme Court will respond to Trump's request for a stay on the DC Circuit's denial of presidential immunity? Will they take the case or simply let the judgment stand? If they deny, what are the consequences for Trump and the elections? Would you like to pick this one up first, and then I have another follow-up for Arancha afterwards?
Yeah. So I'm not at the Supreme Court bar. I'm not an attorney, but I read an enormous amount about this. I think the general view is that the court will either not take up the case and not issue a stay, or take the case and fairly. And determine that Trump is not entitled to blanket immunity of the kind that he has claimed. the claims that he makes are completely outlandish. And as both Judge Chutkan at the district court and as the appeals court opinion has also affirmed, are completely out of the American legal tradition and have nothing to do with our jurisprudence. So I don't think the court will support him. He did appoint 3 justices to the court, but many experts have been noting that the court has been sending him a lot of signals that that they will not behave like friends to him if he continues to pursue all these appeals to the court. Of course, he does have another strategy, and that is to run out the clock and to try to postpone all of these trials to beyond the election. I'm skeptical that will happen with all of the cases. And I think the January 6th case, I hope will go to court relatively soon. But, Western legal systems are not known for being nimble and fast moving.
Well, thank you. That's a very helpful insight. I wanted to pick up on the earlier debate about the European response in terms of economic security, strategic autonomy, and turn perhaps to some institutional changes that Europe might make to have. Daniel, you alluded to qualified majority voting. And so I just wanted to push you a little bit, Arancha, on what could be done on an institutional reform level to really pick up these challenges if we look at the transatlantic picture as a whole. But I also want to give our audience another chance to throw a question in. So we'll collect these, and let me hand over the floor to Helmut Hoffmann. You're still muted.
It is. Okay.
There we go.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Helmut Hoffmann, retired German Foreign Service official. On this issue of strengthening European defense, I will leave aside the big issue of how plausible the underlying assumption is of a Russian attack on Western Europe, other than to say armed forces who were not able to conquer the 4 oblasts which the Russians annexed, to assume that they would attack Western Europe, it doesn't strike me as terribly plausible, but that's just aside. What exactly is the problem of European defense? Is it a lack of military hardware? To put it a bit crudely, do we need more tanks, fighter aircraft, etc., etc.? Or is it rather that we Europeans know perfectly well that when it really matters, we don't muster the collective political will to use the rather significant military hardware we have, actually. And I think that is really of the essence, a correct analysis of these 2 issues. Because if it is the latter, and I would submit it is the latter, that we know that, we don't even have European command structures. I can remind you that we've had a debate of over 25 years, I would say, of creating a European command structure, and it was always rejected by our British friends, duplication of NATO, etc. it. So if our analysis is not correct on these 2 issues, we might just go into the entirely wrong direction. It doesn't help us much to buy more tanks and fighter aircraft, etc., if we don't have the structures and the political will to use them when it really matters. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That's a great question, and perhaps in some ways even relates to what I asked before. So let me hand over to Arancha first, and perhaps the others want to come in after that as well.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting question. I would not put tanks and troops first of the list in what Europe needs to do on defense, because this is not where Europe has a problem. Europe has 2 problems, fundamentally. The first one has to do with the ability to interconnect all the different elements that you need to defend today, not to defend in the 20th century, but to defend today. Air-to-air, cyber capacities, intelligence. All of this is what today requires interconnection, and the key to the interconnection of all these ingredients today in NATO is in the hands of the US. So if there is a problem to European security, this key that unlocks the interconnection of all these different ingredients is in the hands of the US. And this is fine when you are in an alliance that's a military and security alliance, but it is not fine when this alliance is led by someone that does not deal with these matters in an adult manner, which is what we have just seen last week. These are essentially matters of life and death, and therefore have to be dealt with like adults and not like with tweets. So first problem we have is to make more investments in the elements that would require, give us the ability to defend in a 360 degrees. The second problem we have is one of fragmentation of our single market on the defense industry. And this is a big issue because it's not just that we are spending more, it's that we are spending more, but maybe not in a manner that would benefit the incredible defense industry that we have in Europe. We have defense industry for air, for land, for sea, for naval, but we are too fragmented. And this brings me back to a fundamental point that, in my view, we need to deal with in Europe, which is the single market. The single market is deficient in three fundamental areas, where Jacques Delors at the time did not manage to advance. These three areas are essentially where today we are short of competitiveness. It's defense and security, it's technology, meaning digital, and it is energy. These three are the, let's say, single market black holes where, in a way, we can invest. So I would put these two top of the list. And of course, there is an issue of political will, but we have seen that political will can be mobilized, like we are seeing now for Ukraine in a big way. But the first two need to be there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Because we don't have that much time left, I want to pick up two more questions that we have in the audience and then collect these and have a round of closing remarks for each one of you. So please, quick introductions and question comments. First, Tom O'Donnell, and then Milutin Stanisiewicz.
You know, we're in this phase of a protracted war. Neither side seems to be able to carry out sustained offensive. So in a way, Putin depends on protracted war for its economic and other impacts it's having on Europe. But I think in thinking of protracted war where a great power can't win, I remember all my experience with Vietnam. And what the United States did is it expanded the war into other countries. It devastated Vietnam when it couldn't occupy the country. It bombed it to hell. But also in the current situation, I think something that militarily Europe and NATO has to think about, and I'd like to see your response on this. You know, it's in order to stop Russian oil, there's a certain de facto coordination now between the use of drones by Ukraine against Baltic oil and the intensification of sanctions by the United States. So that's going to really hurt Russia in a protracted war. And I would expect, you know, some drones hit the Svet refinery, but they might come from the West and nobody knows where they came from. Things like this, that is hard to attribute as a way of sending a signal, crossing red lines, but not obviously. So, you know, how would NATO respond to such things? I think we have to think about this. I'd like to see what people think.
Thanks a lot. So we've got this question on military scenarios, which is tricky. And as we're waiting for the last question, which I think will be posted in the chat in a moment, I just want to throw in a final fun question for all of you to think about as you come up with your closing remarks. We're looking ahead to the Munich Security Conference. What would you expect? What would be a good result in terms of the debate that we've been having today that could come out of Munich? What are the kinds of conversations that you think should be had in the Grand Hall of the Bayerischer Hof this weekend? So I think we've got a round of interesting questions for the closing remarks. I'd like to suggest that we go in reverse order of the panel. So Guntram first, Dan second, and then Arancha. And if Milutin Stanisiewicz is posting question in the chat, please feel free to pick that one up as well. But I think we've got plenty for the only 5 minutes that we've got left. Guntram.
Well, thank you, Jan. So your last question on Munich. I mean, I hope we will not only discuss Trump, right? So my hope is that there's so many really huge issues that we need to discuss. I would love us to discuss certainly the role of China in many of the issues we just discussed, but especially on the economic dimension and on the climate dimension. I think that really is a conversation that needs to advance for Munich, because I'm not in the camp of those saying, China is just another one in the gang of the bad guys, right? I mean, so there are those people, some people that say this, and I think it's a mistake. I think China is certainly a major power that wants to shape things, but it's not a destructionist power like Russia is. And so I think really getting the conversation right and differentiating between those different powers and their aims, I think is really important. And certainly I think the Europeans would be mistaken to just sort of follow the very sort of one-dimensional debate of the United States on China. So that's perhaps my first point. And the second on the drones from the West, if I understood correctly. So I would be extremely cautious or against sort of launching drones from NATO countries on Russia. I think the principle that certainly the German government is pursuing, but I think also all European allies is really that, and NATO allies is really that we do not want to be direct party to the war, right? And I think this is very important. So let's try to uphold that principle as much as possible. Mm. And the last point is really on. And, I think I totally agree with Arancha on sort of the strategic assets that we do not have at the moment and in which we have to invest, and the command structures and the decision structures, which are very, very important. And I think just to give you a flavor, the big debate we also had in our group is to what extent is this going to be some sort of a European NATO type of thing. So NATO is a well-established organization with tens of thousands of employees, with structures and so on. So should we sort of think about a European part of that NATO that could operate at the limit without the United States, but would still use the resources that are there? Or should we be thinking about building sort of at the EU level separate structures? And I think we tend to say, well, let's use what we have, meaning let's work with the European part of NATO and collaborate there. But of course, on the single market, and there I agree totally with Arancha. We need to start thinking about procurement in European defense markets and, really get this together. So let me stop here.
Thanks. Dan.
Quick points to Tom O'Donnell's question about essentially covert operations by the West. I think the Ukrainians are doing a pretty damn good job themselves of striking targets in Russia. And I think that we ought to just continue to admire their intrepid activities. The Russians are already carrying out enough mischievous actions in the West. I don't think we want to get into an escalatory cycle. Conversations coming out of Munich. Well, I agree. There's a lot to talk about. China should always be on the agenda. I would say that if I had one wish for Munich, it's that Europeans would buttonhole members of U.S. congressional delegations from the Republican Party until those guys can't stand, when women cannot stand anymore, to make it clear that the MAGA approach to alliances is ultimately undermining American security. I don't have any great hopes it'll make a huge difference, but sometimes you just got to get caught trying. And finally, I wanted to go back to Helmut Hoffman's point. Yes, I do think that procurement needs to increase, but I also agree that the dimension of political will and the sense of being frontline states has not been achieved. I think there's been, shall we say, a failure of political leadership on this to educate the public that, in fact, Europeans are in a very different era than they were. And I understand why it's politically sensitive, but better to have those conversations up front. And I think that dovetails a bit with what Arancha was saying about the upcoming European elections. Finally, it is true that Russia has shown itself to be not the strongest military in Europe, but the second strongest in Ukraine. At the same time, if Trump is elected, I would not rule out the possibility that the Russians would try to, let's just say, make life very difficult for our Baltic neighbors, who they still don't consider to be true members of the West. And so I think we have to, keep our minds flexible and think about all possible contingencies. So why don't I stop there?
Thank you, Dan. And the final comments are yours, Arancha.
I will just end with the question that we Europeans need to address, which is how to best protect ourselves. This is a core issue for us. And there, dismissing the potential threats around us, hoping or wishing that they will not happen, in my view, is not a very wise strategy. Equally, we need to have a serious conversation. I would transform this political will debate into having a conversation about how best we protect ourselves. Is it by investing in sovereignty at the national level, or is it by investing in European sovereignty? European sovereignty in the last crisis we have had, from COVID to Brexit to the presidency of Donald Trump, is what gave us teeth. Final point on the Munich Security Conference. I hope that in addition, very much agree with Dan, in addition to hoping and prodding members of U.S. Congress to say it, spell it clearly, I also think we've got a big issue in the Middle East that is a big concern for Europe, because this is yet another conflict in the vicinity, in the borders of the European Union. And I do hope that there, too, we make a little bit of progress in Munich.
Thank you so much, Arancha. And because there are so many conflicts, this series will continue. We hope to welcome you next week and the week after. But for today, let me thank our distinguished panel and all of you in the audience for a brilliant debate. Have a lovely day and all the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.